Hello, I'm Molly. I work as Capercaillie Advisory Officer for the RSPB. I'm also part funded by the Cairngorms Capercaillie project and NatureScot. And today I'm going to be talking about capercaillie counting and conservation. So capercaillie are actually the world's largest grouse, and they are found in populations across Europe, but in the UK they are restricted to Scotland. They live in pine forests. Scots pine is their preferred species. It's a native species. They feed on pine needles during the winter months, and then during the spring, summer months, they're more diverse diet. So they'll feed on stuff growing on a field layer, with blaeberry being a particularly important plant. The chicks will eat invertebrates for the first 4 weeks of their life. So blaeberry is also a great host of invertebrates, and bog is also a great habitat for capercaillie because of those invertebrates and the cotton grass, which is a great nutrient-rich diet food resource for the adult birds. So this is taken at a capercaillie elec. So this is when the birds mate. So essentially the males will return to the same areas in the forest year on year, roughly, if conditions remain suitable, and they will display, and the aim of that is to attract in females to mate with. So they'll start these displays pre-dawn from about 4 a.m. if not earlier, and it tends to be just one alpha, maybe two alpha birds that the hens will mate with. After the lek season, the hens will then go away and brood rear her chicks, and they nest in a scrape on the ground, and they will be with the chicks until about August time, and then the chicks will be fully independent and able to fledge. So I wanted to chat a little bit about how we count this species and perhaps some of the challenges we face in counting such an elusive species, particularly when they are quite rare. So the main way we get national population estimates for capercaillie is through conducting our national surveys. We've been doing this since the early 90s, and we do it every 6 years. We believe that there was about 20,000 capercaillie in Scotland in the 1970s, but as you can see, there's been a pretty steep decline since then. So these national surveys essentially involve trained surveyors walking across the Capercaillie range. It's the same method that's used every time so that we can directly compare them. So they'll walk transects and collect information on primarily sightings, but also signs of capercaillie. And that allows us to get a national estimate. So the birds, or the estimate, was varying between about 1,000 and 2,000 birds, with fairly wide confidence intervals since the early 90s. But unfortunately, our most recent national survey in the winter of 2021-2022 estimated about a 50% decline on the previous survey, with only roughly 542 birds estimated to be remaining in Scotland. So we're definitely in a quite serious situation with capercaillie now. This just demonstrates the capercaillie range. So the purple areas are the capercaillie SPAs. So they range from the most northern region is in Easter Ross, and the most southern region is in Tayside. The vast majority are within the Cairngorms National Park, with Strathspey and Deeside. And Strathspey, Badenoch and Strathspey in particular, has over 80% of the population. So that is definitely the stronghold, and that's what those red lines are indicating at the capercaillie core areas. So another way we count capercaillie on an annual basis is through doing lek counts. So essentially, because the birds return roughly to the same area every year when they lek, we can get a count on the males and compare that year on year. We do record the females, but they don't always attend every single morning. So the hens will tend to come in on certain mornings. So it's not as a useful index to count, but of course it's still important data. So we do record when we see them. So this method essentially involves, if we know where a lek is and it's quite steady, we can use a hide to count the birds from. So this is a photo of a hide. They're very tiny, basically very uncomfortable tents with no ground sheet and quite heavy to carry around and not particularly waterproof. So they're not the most glamorous thing to spend a night in, but that's what we do. We go in the night before, sleep-ish overnight, and then make sure we're ready to count the birds from 4 a.m. Because it is dark still at that time, we do these counts in about the last 2 weeks of April. That tends to be the peak peak time for birds to be lekking. It can be challenging, so we do have to listen, but also started using thermal imagers to help us with these counts. If we're less sure where a lek is, or if there's a lek there at all, then we'll tend to do a walkover survey in the early morning to see if there is any sign of birds, but preferably we always use highs because this is the way that we can reduce disturbance and probably get the most accurate count we can. So this is just some data on the lek count. So we get that minimum number of males that we can compare year on year. And you can see, again, there's been a decline since 2015. So the last national survey was the winter of 2015-2016. And we have seen consistent declines, apart from the last 2 years where actually we had the exact same number of males overall, which is quite interesting. But this splits it down by the different regions, and it's just showing, gets a useful annual insight into what's happening with the birds. We're also trialling something new. So through the Cairngorms Capercaillie project that I'll be touching on a little bit more later on in the presentation, we are trialling a genetic lek survey. And this essentially looks at gathering their droppings and getting genetic information from these. And we'll look to compare what is found with these droppings, so the total number of birds and individuals that are identified from the droppings compared to what we see when we do our lek count from the hides. We're only doing a very small scale study this year. We've only chosen a couple of leks to trial this at, but there has been success in doing this internationally. So we're quite hopeful that this could be maybe an option, potentially less disturbing because we don't have to be there in the early morning when the birds are lekking, but it depends on how many times you have to go in to collect droppings. So it's very much a pilot study, but it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. And we're hoping to get that report in September this year. And then finally, the other counts we do involve brood counts. So this gets information on the birds' productivity. Traditionally, this has involved trained dogs and handlers going out into Capercaillie Forest in August. So this is when the chicks are big and able to fly, but they're likely to still be in a family party and still be identified as juveniles rather than adults. So then essentially the birds are flushed and they are counted that way. That's reduced over time through a few reasons. One, it's very resource intensive and there's not a huge number of trained dogs and handlers available for these counts. And also there are concerns that this is obviously going to be quite disturbing for the birds. So we want to make sure we do it when we absolutely need this productivity data. So we have been trialling using camera traps across Cairngorms Connect in particular, including RSPB Abernethy Reserve. And that's shown some initial signs that this could be a useful method. It's still early days, but we've had some nice photos of broods, which is also always nice. So a little bit more into the threats and what we're doing to try and conserve Capercaillie. So the threats to Capercaillie are very varied. Habitat is a big one. There's not a huge amount of suitable habitat for Capercaillie, and what is available can be quite fragmented, and the birds don't have a huge dispersal distance, and they also don't like crossing lots of open ground. We do a lot to try and improve and extend habitat, and a lot of that comes down to deer management. So obviously, if the deer numbers are too high, forests will struggle to expand and link, and also the deer can overgraze the field layer, which has important plants, like I mentioned earlier, like blaeberry. So it is a challenge, but it's definitely an important thing we're working on. Fence collisions is another risk to Capercaillie. So Capercaillie can collide with essentially mostly deer fences. So if the deer fences are running through or close to a forest, the birds fly quite low. They don't fly up and over the trees. They tend to fly straight through the trees, and sometimes they can't see them. We find this is especially the case with juveniles that are just a bit less savvy and aware of fences in general and where they are. So what we do with that is we advise that deer are controlled without fences ideally and are just cold, but if fences are absolutely necessary, then we strongly advise they are marked to increase visibility and reduce that collision risk. Predation is another threat. Lots of things will eat a Capercaillie, and we have high numbers of these generalist mesopredators in Scotland and the UK generally. So things like foxes and crows, but also other species and other protected species like pine marten and raptors. I was once on a lek when a juvenile golden eagle came in to try and take an alpha male Capercaillie. The Capercaillie got away on that instance, but it just demonstrates that lots of things will eat them, especially nests and eggs and chicks. So that can be an issue, and it can be challenging to manage, especially when some of these species are protected themselves. Climate change, that's another one. So that can have a real impact on the bird's productivity, especially high rainfall when the chicks are small. So in May, June time, they can get overly chilled and get hypothermia. And then finally, human disturbance, that can reduce the habitat further because capercaillie avoid areas that are very busy, like forest tracks, for instance, and can also have a direct impact on their fitness and productivity by increasing their stress levels and potentially avoid stopping them mating at leks or separating the hens from the chicks. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Cairngorms Capercaillie project. This has been the sort of biggest bit of work that's been going on directly with Capercaillie the last few years. It's a national lottery heritage funded partnership project, and it's being led by the Cairngorms National Park Authority, and the delivery phase started in 2020 and we're actually in our last year now. We're into 2023, and the overall aim of this project is to enable communities to secure the long-term survival of capercaillie. It's primarily focusing on reducing that human disturbance issue because visitor numbers in some of the key capercaillie areas are always on the rise, so it's something we really need to tackle. So in terms of the work, there's 5 key areas of work with this project. This is probably the biggest. So this is working with communities. So this can be communities of place, like local residents, but also communities of interest that might have potential conflict with capercaillie, and we want to try and work with them, like mountain bikers, and also working with local businesses and visitors to the capercaillie areas, and creating community-led action plans to try and conserve capercaillie and reduce the negative impacts of human disturbance. As well as all that community work, there is some other stuff that we've been in that project, including improving habitat for capercaillie. So we have improved over 10,000 hectares of habitat for capercaillie with working with local land managers and providing them financial support. A lot of this work's also been done with volunteers, local people, which is great because it's a way to engage them with this work and raise awareness about capercaillie. So this is just an example of some volunteers marking a fence there, which again is to reduce that collision risk for capercaillie. So we're also doing some research into the genetic diversity of capercaillie. So we collected a lot of feathers, so over 600 feathers in 2019, and we're working with RZSS to analyse these to get an idea about the levels of diversity of capercaillie. And this will give us an indication maybe of the health of the birds. So we've also managed to get samples from international capercaillie populations and historical Scottish populations from museums and private collections. So we'll get that really good availability to compare and contrast what the current Scottish population is like, and that will help inform future management for capercaillie, and we're hoping to get that report pretty soon now in April this year, so that's quite exciting. Strengthen capercaillie monitoring. So again, this is primarily the pilot genetic lek survey I mentioned, but also we've been funding other bits and bobs. We've been funding some more brood counts in areas. They've been doing interventions that we really want to test whether they're working, and we've also been putting out camera traps and funding thermal imagers and just stuff to try and improve our monitoring as much as possible so we can make the most informed decisions. And finally, this project is all about raising awareness of capercaillie and finding that fine line between we want people to love and care about protecting capercaillie, but we also don't want them to be disturbed. And that can be especially the case with people that are very passionate about capercaillie and want to see them, birders, photographers, etc. That in itself can be a real risk to the birds. So it's a challenging one, trying to get people to care but don't want people to go and see them. So it's always a line that we're trying to walk carefully, but it's something that is very, very important. The only way we're going to save capercaillie is if people both care about the birds and understand what they can really do to protect them. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that was an interesting insight into capercaillie counting and conservation, and I'm happy to take any questions.